Hi everyone, my name is Francis, and today I'll be talking about animations in jQuery. I'll be assuming you know the basics of jQuery and CSS. There are a few problems one can run into when learning how to use animations in jQuery. We will cover how to resolve them and understand what caused them. We will also cover animation callback functions and how the animation queue works. Finally, how to choose between using a CSS-based solution or jQuery solution. Let's open up our project. Today we will be making this hover effect, which pulls through some product information and just gives an effect to various elements for the selected product that the user is hovering over. Right, let's start off. What exactly is the animation queue? Well, the animation queue is simply an array of functions stored on a per element basis. Since it's an array, we have access to these standard JavaScript functions. This is pop, unshift, queue, slice as well. I haven't found a real-world use case for these yet. I think it would be rare to need them. However, it's good to have the knowledge that you can make use of them in the event that you find you need it. We're going to be running through a few examples, explaining various ways to work with animating. We're going to be starting with a simple example, which would be the most basic way to use the animate function. Let's go into our code. Comment out the existing one. All right. So the most basic animate function. In this case, what we're going to do is on the product details, which is kind of the global element for each product, we're going to animate the border width, which is the CSS property that you would like to animate. And then the second option here is the value you would like this property to animate to. The last parameter is the duration in milliseconds. In this case, we want the border width to animate to 15 pixels thick over 350 milliseconds. So if we click our product, we will see that to happen. Let's go over, click our product, and we see it animates to a 15 pixel thickness. So yeah, that's the most standard way, the most simple way to handle a jQuery animation. Right, let's build on that. So let's chain two animations together. In this case, we're going to animate to 15 pixels over 350 milliseconds. Here we have a very useful function that can be used, is delay. So in this case, we're going to delay for 1000 milliseconds before the next function is called. So after our border hits 15 pixels, we will wait for a second, and then we're going to animate the opacity back down to 0.5 over 150 milliseconds. So if we click the product now, we will see that happen. Let's click the product, border goes to 15, wait a second, opacity goes down. All right, how do we build on that then? Well, what if we want to animate two things at once, two properties at once? In this case, we want to animate the border width and the margin. Both of these values will go to this specified amount, 15 and 20. And both of these properties will animate to this value over the same 350 milliseconds. So it's going to look very similar to what we just saw with the delay and then opacity down to 0.5. This won't look super great, but you'll get the picture quite easily. So we click on our product, and then the margin and the border happens at the same time, and then the opacity comes in. Okay, so let's say for whatever reason we would like to use some CSS in the animation queue. So what you think you might do is have your chain of animate and then do .css and then try to change a property like this. However, if we run this, you expect the border width to change, delay, opacity, and then after all of that is done, the background to change to black. If we actually do this though, we see that the CSS change is applied instantly. So how can we get around this? There's a few ways. I'll start with the most simple way to understand, and this will be using a callback function. Inside the animate function, you can have a callback, and that callback runs when the animation is complete. So if we want the background color to change when the opacity is done animating, we can add a function here, and inside that function we can run any code we want. And in this case, we want to change the CSS background color to black. So now it will work as expected with everything happening sequentially. Awesome. The callback function is very easy to use. It makes sense. The only downside is you don't want to be nesting callback functions too much, purely just for neatness. There's better ways and different ways to queue up animations, which we will check out now. So, working with the queue, this is the primary way to do it. We have our two animations here, border width and opacity, and then we want to modify the queue for this element, which we click. So inside the queue, we can add custom code that can run, and this item here is added sequentially, to the animation queue. You can call anything here, even a console log command, any custom code. So this is fairly flexible. This is also a bit neater than using the callbacks. The one upside to using the callbacks, though, is if you just need to quickly do one thing at the end, it's a bit quicker to do that instead of this. So if we run this, we'll see exactly the same result as using the callback. However, we are just directly editing the queue. Okay. One more useful thing with the jQuery animate function is to have the ability to simultaneously run animations at once. If for whatever reason having the properties in the same animate function won't work and you need them to run at different speeds, or just start simultaneously and do completely different things, you can also add some additional parameters to make them happen at the same time. So in our case, we're going to animate the border width to 15 over 350, and then we're going to animate the margin to 15. Instead of simply defining the milliseconds of the duration, we're going to add two parameters here. We're going to specify the duration to be 350, and then we're going to add another one saying queue false. The queue false will take this command out of the animation queue, and this will just run simultaneously alongside all of our code. So we expect now to see the border width and the margin change simultaneously, which is what happens. Okay, so how can we make this a little bit more applicable to a real scenario? In this case, we're going to combine two things that we just learned, which is the callback and the queue. It generally would be best to do one or the other, but they do work together. In this case, everything here will run sequentially, including the callback. So the callback is included in the queue, and then this, which will give us a quick error log, will run after the background color is changed to black, which will seem fairly instant, but it will be part of the queue. After the console's logged, it will change back to white. We click our product, get the error log, goes black, goes white. All right. Okay, to take this more into a practical sense, we're going to, instead of a click, we're going to apply some animations on hover. So now on hover, we're going to apply a border width of 15, and a callback of the hover function is when your mouse exits. So we'll animate to 15 when your mouse enters and animate to 0 when your mouse exits. So if we run this, 15, and then when you exit 0. However, if you have a large product grid, or the user can hover over many things quite quickly, such as this, you'll start to see this type of looping and non-stop effect. So one way to get around this is to start manipulating the queue. So what needs to happen now is if we leave, we need to stop all queued animations because we don't want any additional animations to run if our cursor isn't there. jQuery makes it very easy to do that. We can simply call the clear queue command and then followed by the stop function. The clear queue will remove all queued animations when the user's mouse leaves the element, and will also stop the current one. After it stopped the current one, the next command will run, which is just animating it back to 0, which would be the default state for the product. So if we call this and we quickly hover over all of our products, we'll see we don't get that effect where the animation continues even though the user's cursor is not inside. Right, so how do we combine this all to give the final effect that I showed at the start of the video? So it was this product information pulls through and there's some slight tilting and whatnot. Let's run through how I did that. So the first thing we're going to do is simply add a class to the product name, which is just the name and price here. Afterwards, we're going to animate the border to 15 over 350 milliseconds. We have a callback here that will run once this is complete. We're going to find the image inside of the product and simply rotate it by 10 degrees, which will give us this tilt effect. And then after that, we're going to show the info pop-up. This class contains the product details that we'll pull through, giving extra information about our product. And we want to animate this left by 50 pixels over 150 milliseconds. This way, these two will slide in simultaneously. These two commands are not in a queue. CSS will apply by itself, and the animation will start also simultaneously. And this is the intended effect to seem like the paint is pulling out the information section. Then we have our hover callback. So when the user leaves the element, we want to clear the queue of all remaining animations, stop the current one, and then animate everything back to its default value. So we remove the class, we animate it back to its default position, and then fade it out. We want to animate the border width of the entire product back to 0, and we want to rotate the image back to its normal position. This way, if the user goes in and out, all the elements will animate from scratch instead of from where they were last left off. So that's a very important step to do, resetting everything back to how it was. Right, so I've gone over a few scenarios using both animate and simply changing CSS. So it is important to take into consideration what to use. The pros of CSS is, in most cases, better performance. In most cases, it also covers most of your needs. There's very limited scenarios where you need extra animation on top of a simple hover effect for the one element. And it is a bit cleaner simply because it's less code and also less JavaScript load if you're worried about that. The pros of jQuery, it's more flexible and a bit easier to add functionality into your hover effects. It is easy to access other elements where CSS pseudo elements or active hover states are not suitable. Now, example, we're using the animate function to chain additional effects on other elements, not just the global element that we hovered. So I hope you can take some of these concepts and apply it to your next project. It's definitely useful to give a bit of extra effects and responsiveness when the user is navigating your site. I think it definitely can push something from an 8 to a 9 or 10. So today we covered how to work with animations in jQuery, how to use callback functions and modify the queue, and also how to get around the queue by running things simultaneously if you need to. I've showed some examples about hover states, the importance of clearing the queue and stopping, and then resetting all of your animations back to their original state to create a smooth experience, and also some information on how to decide whether you should use CSS or jQuery for your effects. All right, I hope everyone learned something, and see you next time for Tech Tuesday.